Part 3. Roads Leading South. The mail service caught up with the Army just as it was leaving the Spotsylvania courthouse area. And for the first time since they crossed the Rapidan, the men got letters from home. They also got newspapers, which they read with eager curiosity. And as they read these papers, they discovered anew that the war, as it was described for people back home, bore very little resemblance to the war which they themselves were actually fighting. In a Massachusetts battery, the men hooted at newspaper accounts which proclaimed that Lee's army was utterly routed and fleeing in confusion. It did not really make much difference, for there was nothing the outside world could tell these soldiers anyway. The Army's world was enclosed by cavalry patrols and moving skirmish lines. And in the obscurity beyond those boundaries, there was the rebel army, sometimes out of sight, but never out of touch. The normal state of all previous armies, the state in which most of the soldiers' time was spent, was neither marching nor fighting, but quiet life in camp, barracks, or garrison. An army might march far and fight furiously, but when all of its days as an army were added up, it would be found that most of them had been dull, monotonous days of inaction. But from the moment the Army of the Potomac crossed the Rapidan on May 5th to the end of the war 11 months later, there was no inaction whatever. Instead, there was marching or fighting every day, and very often both together, and physical contact with the enemy was never wholly broken. The final grapple had begun, and the war had become a war of using up men and emotions, and the wild, impossible dreams that had called the armies into being in the first place. And everything that Americans would ever do thereafter would be affected in one way or another by what remained after the using up was completed. The armies were moving on parallel lines. They were never far apart, and they bumped and jostled each other as they moved, a fringe of fire running up and down the lines, with cavalry patrols fighting for the possession of lonely road crossings, artillery defending the fords and bridges at streams, infantry skirmishers colliding on plantation fields. Strange new names were entered on the Army's annals: Ox Ford and Quarles Mill and Jericho Ford, and the other crossings of the North Anna River. Roads down to the Pamunkey, places like Hawes's Shop and Bethesda Church, and the rambling network of highways that led to a desolate crossroads known as Cold Harbor. In all of these places, there was fighting, and before and after each fight, there was a forced march, and the Army neither won nor lost as it moved on. It added to its knowledge and to its losses, and it got deeper and deeper into Virginia. But it never quite got around the end of the rebel army, and the big showdown was always somewhere ahead. The Army had conquered nothing, and it possessed not a foot of Virginia soil except the ground on which it actually stood. Grant scorned to look behind him. To keep a safe supply line open all the way back to Belle Plain and Aquia Creek on the Potomac would take too many fighting men away from the front, so he simply refused to try. When the Army left Spotsylvania, the bases on the Potomac were closed. For the time being, a new base was opened at Port Royal, downstream from Fredericksburg on the Rappahannock. That was closer to the Army, and as soon as the distance back to Port Royal became too great, a new base could be opened at White House on the Pamunkey. There was significance in this, for names can be important. At the beginning of the war, the Army had been named the Army of the Potomac, and the overtones of that name had never been forgotten. Above everything else, the Army had been the shield of Washington, standing near the Potomac River to defend the capital. Now the ties had been cut. The Army had left the river from which it took its name, and it was not going to see that river again while the war lasted. It was going south, going glacially, destroying itself as it destroyed other things, but moving with inevitability. The only roads that were left led on into more fighting, and the Army that followed these roads looked less and less like the Army that had crossed the Rapidan a few weeks earlier. Famous old organizations were vanishing, and famous old names were disappearing. John Sedgwick had been killed, and what had once been Joe Hooker's division no longer existed, and the Iron Brigade was no longer recognizable. After the war was over, someone asked crusty Brigadier General Romaine Ayres if his famous old division of regulars was still in service at this time. I had regulars, what were known as the Regular Division, before I went into the Battle of Gettysburg, he replied. I left half of them there and buried the rest in the wilderness. There were no regulars left.